Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 117 of Kouryer podcast. Our today's guest is Mr. Sam King. He's a character artist, art director, and collectible designer from Cape Town, South Africa, which we will talk about these subjects later in the podcast. Now, let's jump into the first question that I ask everyone. Give us a little introduction on how you got into visual arts and design.
Sure. It's quite a while ago now, but initially I did train as a graphic designer, and then I took a small course in animation, generic animation. And it was probably, I think that was a year or two. And then I entered the industry in architecture because at that time, particularly here in South Africa, there was not a very large, well, it's almost no industry. There were a few companies, but not many. So I tried to apply there and they just weren't hiring. But then a friend worked at an architecture firm and they hired me to do CAD work. So I was turning CAD drawings into architectural renders. It's ArcViz, which a lot of 3D artists do. And I did that for about 6 months. It was good. It was good pay and stuff, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. And then I'm also British, so I decided to go to England and I applied for a job in the game industry there with a very small studio, which now no longer exists. But then I started working in games and I started getting the experience I wanted. So that's the general process and entry point for me.
All right, and if I was wondering, what do you remember? What year was it that you entered game studio?
2004.
Ah, like around the time when World of Warcraft came around, yeah, that was a really important year for video games.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
This wasn't
and
a big studio. This was a very small, I wouldn't say indie, but they did develop for PlayStation and GameCube. So I started to learn how to make stuff for those platforms. But the games, to be honest, were not great. But it was my entry point. And down the line, I worked on the bigger stuff, which people will know the names of. But to begin with, I entered a no-name studio. I think I was one of three artists. Thankfully, they were developing for console, so I learned how to make stuff for console then, and I've used that knowledge throughout my whole career. So, although the studio and the games were nothing fancy at all, the process was very worthwhile to learn.
all right, yeah, you gotta always start somewhere. And yeah, I
Mm.
mean that definitely came in handy, that experience, as you said. And I was just wondering, based on your answer, I have another question for you. Were you originally studying like art and design, or you were pursuing another career path, like when you were like in high school? Like, did you know from the get go that you kind of liked art, or you thought you might have to go another stable route, then go to art? Like, you know what I mean?
Yes, I get entirely what you mean. Thankfully, my family comes from an academic background, so I am quite unusual being an artist. My dad's an engineer, my mother's a professor in water science. So I could have had pressure gone in to be pushed into those areas, but thankfully they were quite sort of holistic with their approach, and they just pretty much wanted me to be happy and find something I was good at. So they let me go my own way. I must admit I was a bit late to the sort of art. I always drew and painted, but just because I just did it by default. But I spent a lot of my teenage years skateboarding and messing around. To be honest, I didn't do much studying. But eventually, I liked computer games and I played them. And then about 16, 17, I saw World of Warcraft 2. And I saw the drawings in the book by there's an art director called Chris Metzen and Samwise Didier, the art directors there now. And I could draw it about that level, a little bit worse, but I could see I could do that stuff. And then I realized there's people who their job is to do that stuff. They get paid to draw beasties and monsters and stuff. And like, I can do that. And I really like doing that. And so started drawing and painting a bit more and picking up some computer programs, but I really entered CG graphics at about 2021. And that's when I studied. I didn't know where to study, I didn't know what to do. So I studied a graphic design course, so typography and stuff. Still drawing and stuff in the backgrounds. And then eventually I went to an animation school where I picked up the programs like Maya and stuff that people use today. So it's a very long, convoluted path, but I got there eventually. I always drew and was creative. I lived in that creative world. I like reading books like Lord of the Rings, but to apply that to something took me a while to find it. So teenage years, just drawing and goofing off and stuff like that. And eventually I realized I had to like make a plan. I couldn't mess around and skateboard for my whole life. So started applying towards animation and gaming. I always liked, but I sort of just found my way in that one as well. The main thing for me was going into a country with a developed game industry, which was England, and then they picked me up, and then I took it on from there.
All right, that's interesting. I kind of have another question about the stuff you said. You said you worked as a visual archivist, if I'm not mistaken, and I was
Oculus,
wondering
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, and I was wondering, is that like a viable career choice for people who have not gone through like architectural training, but they know pretty well how
Yes,
to render
yeah,
and
I
make
can.
3D models of houses?
Yes, it's very viable. It's a good industry to go in. There's a lot of money in ArcViz because obviously you're building property, and property there's just money. There's a lot of money in the general property space. So if you're attached to that industry in any way, so I exited college and going into ArcViz, and I was earning quite a bit. It's not much in comparison to what like an experienced professional, but somebody out of college with almost no skills, it was amazing for me. But I chose to leave it because I just did not want to go that road. But definitely, there's a whole subsection where you have the architects that draw up the plans, and usually 2D, but they use 3D these days called Revit, I think. But the old school stuff was called CAD, 2D CAD, and that'll still be a computer program. But then they need to visualize the projects generally to sell to clients, be it actual tenants or companies buying the buildings. And so traditionally they would have done those with physical models, like you see the balsa wood constructed houses. But nowadays it's mostly in CG because you can fly a camera through the house and get a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like in the end. So they need to employ people to do that because it's one of their selling tools. The 3D artists obviously come into that space because they know how to build and render stuff, but they get towards the technical side because they need to pull in the architectural plans, and it has to be very much to spec. So if you build a door or a window, it has to be like within millimeter correct. You have to work in correct space and put everything properly because people are buying the property off that visual representation a lot of the time. So you got to be very accurate. So that's it. And yes, there is a whole area of 3D of people who do that, and it's very viable. There's a lot of people who do it.
Interesting. Like you learn, like what I learn every day is that how much like potential like just learning 3D has in terms of job
It's
market,
a lot of
especially in
work.
the future. It's even
Yeah.
getting more. That's insane.
No, more. It's like I entered this industry randomly because I was just interested and it appealed to me. But I'm at the state now where most of the 3D industries are booming. So the amount of opportunities out there are insane. It's crazy. And there's a lot of applications. There's things like 3D printing and stuff, which I do a lot of, which things you could have never imagined 5 years ago. And then it's going into the VR space. And then yeah, it just goes on and on and on, and then into like space, like design. Like some people I know work can end up working for NASA designing stuff, and they're 3D artists. Film, games, architecture. It goes on and on and on. It's because it's a very applicable skill set, like working in 3D. And now it's going into the physical space where your 3D things become physical things, very real with 3D printers, and across the board it's growing. There's no decline anywhere. So there's a lot of, if you're good, there's a lot of work. Yeah.
Interesting. And all right, let's jump back into the questions we were going with. I want to ask, what is your main branch of design that you're focusing on right now? And tell us about your experience from the start of it until now. I mean, of course, in the introduction, I mentioned you're a character artist, art
Yeah.
director, collectible designer. But if you could like explain what your main branch of design is right now, profession is right now in visual arts, and
Sure.
explain your experiences from it,
Sure.
that would be awesome.
Yeah. So mainly these days I work in sort of production designer or art director role, and I've done that for 6 7 years now. So that's my main attachment point for people. But the design aspect I work in is probably more characters these days, although I do more environments. So when you're talking about games or film, you have branches of skill sets, and one of the branches is generally a character artist, and another branch may be environment art, and then there's another one called props and so on. So once you get to the quite the senior or art director level, you're expected to kind of cover all of those to some level. but you will probably still have a background core specialization. So it could be concept art, and I see you spoke to a lot of concept artists. It could be a character builder, a character designer, or character 3D character artist. Like 3D character artists go more towards the building of stuff. They do design a bit, but they actually specialize in making the thing. And then environment design, so they can be designing or building the thing once again. So generally working as an art director or team lead, but then my core skill set is sculpting and designing and building characters, and that's mainly for games. But I also do figurines and collectibles, and I have done film, like animated features, in the past.
All right, interesting. And speaking of like designing, and I want to ask about your how does your design process usually go? Anytime you want to start working on a project, whether it be collectible, whether it be character,
Hmm.
anything. Like how does
Yes.
your pipeline and design process usually go?
Sure, I can get very in depth on this because this is very real to my day to day. So generally, we have a concept artist. So I can do concept, but I generally hire concept artists to help me, or the company I work for delivers the concept to me as a finished piece. So you iterate on the concept art, and that takes quite a while usually because you're figuring out the design. It's not about rendering and getting a pretty 2D image. It's just like working with line and splashes of colors. So you can just figure out the proportions, the layout of details. What is this character or thing? And this is the same with environments. You'll have to go through this whole process where you lay out all the landmarks, you work with the silhouettes, you figure out the player path and stuff like that. All those big design and construction questions should generally be answered in 2D. Then it gets to a point where it's locked off or greenlit, ideally. So finished, and then it gets delivered to the builders, and that'll be the 3D character artist or 3D team at some point, or the digital sculptor who's going to make the collectible. And then they take it through the process of building it for the pipeline they're building it for. So generally, there's a block out, which means you in 3D you block out the mesh or the general thing you're building, just to get all the proportions right, the layout. You're moving things around, you're laying it out, making sure the flow reads, everything, all the big primary detail questions are answered. Once that you feel secure in that, your block out is secure, and then you start going into the iteration and detailing phase where you say for a character, you start building belt buckles and details, and you may sculpt the eyes and the eyelashes, and you build it out. Um, then generally after that, particularly in character art, you'll have what's called the high resolution or high poly phase, where you're building something very, very, very high detail, millions of polygons. So for the character art specifically, and also for the environment art, like for collectibles, you kind of end there and then you start posing, so it's a different, it tangents off there. But for the game art, you condense and you crush the mesh. It's called retopology, so it can run live in an engine. And then what you do is you put UVs on, and then you project all that detail from the high resolution onto the low res. That's why game art looks so good these days. It's not because the low res is a terrible, simple mesh generally, nothing fancy, but it's got all these maps and things projected onto it, which bring in the detail from the high poly. And then you use those baking to like material, texture, like the color and so on, all the different sort of materials you see on the character. And then there'll be an engine integration phase or integrating into 3D pipeline and rendering. And that's essentially getting it to its own goal. And you'll iterate there because generally the first time you get something in, it looks a bit mediocre or bad. And you'll need to iterate on it in the end result platform, be it a game engine or offline renderer, to get it looking super tasty generally. And that's the general pipeline. And ideally, those stages are quite linear and locked. You don't want to go back a lot. And the more professional and skilled the team is, they have more confidence locking items off and passing to the next stage. To go back and forth along that line is sort of wasteful and it's a bit dangerous. So you try to like finish a stage, lock, finish, lock, finish, lock, finish, lock, and move it along the pipeline path.
All right, and I think my next question, you kind of answered it to me, like when you were talking in the first 10 minutes of our conversation. But it's basically the question is this: what was the first art job paycheck you ever got, and what was it for, and how did you feel at the time? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you kind of said out of college you did some
Yeah.
art viz. Was that the answer, or? Was it something else?
Yeah, the first paycheck, I started off in illustration actually. So the first paycheck, and this was in a teenager, so and I started off as a traditional sculptor in clay. So the first time I got money for my art, but it was very intermittent. And at that stage, to be honest, it was just bare money for me. It was illustration and physical sculptures. I made gargoyles for the sides of houses and stuff, random. But then I also illustrated like fantasy characters and Lord of the Rings stuff. So it wasn't like sustainable, but that was the first money I got. But the first sustainable salary I got was architecture. Yes.
All right. And all right, let's take a break from like some of these questions and let's move on to some general subjects we can discuss.
Sure.
First, I want to talk about your collectible designer, and I was wondering your personal preference like when it comes to like collectibles in general, not the stuff you design, but the collectibles you personally maybe collect. What are those? Like, is it Pokemons or is it like
Oh,
what is it?
yeah, I have a deep love for sort of grungy 80s fantasy and science fiction. And it'll be things like Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer. And so, I mean, I have my Warhammer army here. My first one I collected.
Mhm.
I have that's Tyranids.
Oh,
Yeah. So I have a love for 80s and 70s design because it's quite brutal and silly. And so anything to do in that sort of design range where it's classic fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons, Warhammer, that kind of stuff. And I do collect that stuff, yeah. So not so much the superheroes and all that stuff. I understand the appeal, but and because I got a British background, I really like the British sort of design sense. So I think there's
mm,
artists called like Simon Bisley. I've got a Simon Bisley on the wall there, and the classic Warhammer stuff like that. I'd have a very deep love for, and that those are the general things I collect. And then when I build stuff, I try. Well, I project that I want to build that stuff. We can talk about that in the portfolio. So I try and put an image out there that this is what I do and this is what I like doing. And generally, I work within that space doing that kind of stuff. I haven't really ever done a superhero, I don't think, or anything like that. And to be honest, I probably shouldn't because it's not really my interest.
that's kind of fascinating. That especially with Warhammer, I've had British guests before on the podcast, and surprisingly, they've all been Warhammer heads and collectibles and drawings and making like these foam sculptures themselves and coloring them. Like it's actually such an interesting hobby. Like
Yeah,
I've seen.
I find so there's different like I've worked in both areas and I've worked for the American clients as well. The American are generally more focused on superheroes and larger scale thing. And then the Europe and England particularly included that there's a deep background in miniatures. And so all of my miniature work generally is European, most of it, particularly when it gets to that kind of stuff. So the that kind of look you're thinking about, one of my favorite miniature design companies that I can't remember, it's called Black Sun Miniatures, I think, and they're very European look. It's that classic sort of trolls and orcs and stuff.
Mm,
And there's a deep background of miniature painting. For strangely enough, for instance, like all the best miniature painters, like the guys who hand painted, are from Spain, and I don't know why, but there's some amazing Spanish miniature painters, and the designers often come from like mainland Europe, and in England's also could just put a part of that. That it's the same sort of sensibility, and generally no real taste for like superheroes or the larger scale statues. That's generally the American market, and also the South Americans seem really into that stuff as well. So it's there's tastes and regions when it comes to the kind of design and aesthetic, and it's definitely you can lock them down. And then there's Asia as well, which is a completely different one. They generally go for larger scale as well, but then it's all the anime and stuff like that, which is a whole nother design aesthetic.
yeah, that is something interesting to me. That the Warhammer collectible thing. That yeah, I mean you're absolutely right. That how the whole different cultures have different tastes. But
Mm.
me personally, I really enjoy European miniatures and collectibles as well. I mean, I'm personally a minimalist. I like to have as much list stuff as possible in my life. But if I ever wanted to get in a hobby, I'd probably get into something like Warhammer or like collectibles because I can actually customize and edit them, and it's kind of like a
Yeah,
hands-on thing. you
It's a
know?
big part of the culture, and I build stuff for those people. So, what I in the past, like when I build miniatures, you do like multiple sets of hands and heads. You split them off so that people can take an arm off or a hand and put their own one on or another one they get from elsewhere. And as a designer, you have to plan that into building these things because these people generally expect it. They don't want a locked figurine out of a box. They want to be able to pull it apart and mix and match. And the more you can do that for them, the more successful you are as a vendor. So what I do is I sell some of my own figurines on the side so I can watch the dynamics of this. And the more options I give people for my style of miniature, which is that European style, the better they do. If I do one large sculpt locked with no flex in it, it generally doesn't go down so well. People, and also when you got to think about the 3D printers. So there's a certain scale, and they can print in a certain volume. So if you want to do big figures, you have to like split them off so they can you can print it out multiple times and rejoin it just because the volume of the builds. So you have to kind of plan for who you're building the stuff for, and they have expectations, so you have to build for them accordingly.
All right, interesting. And just one thing, like, I was just curious, like, since I've seen, like, from hearing you talk about this stuff, I can actually tell, and it's actually easy to tell that you're super passionate about collectibles and that sort of stuff. And I was wondering, like, what do you think about this whole culture of like NFT collectibles and stuff like that? How do you feel
NFT.
about it? Yes.
I think it's great. I don't know that much. I get people approach me about it, but I haven't really dug into it yet. I think anything that puts the power of in the artist to do their own thing and earn well from it, I'm generally very in favor of that. I just don't know how far the line is and how sustainable it is. I think there's a lot of income for people who seems like roulette at the moment. Like some people really win and they win hard. Then a lot of people are trying to get in there and they're not successful. There's definitely it's definitely viable in a big market, and I think it puts a lot of power into the hands of the creator, the maker of the IP, the thing. So I'm definitely in favor of anything that does that. I've seen that a lot. Like personally, I've started building a business and selling to people directly as opposed to being employed by people. And it's very empowering just to like build your own little thing and sell it directly to people. The people who buy chat to you one on one and they tell you what they want, and that kind of metrics I think is very appealing to a lot of people because at the end of the day, if you can do it full time, you sit down, you go, what I'm going to make today, whatever I want, and then I sell it. So that NFT space seems to be the same sort of idea where people just make their own special thing according to them. They find a market for it one way or another, and they sustain themselves that way.
Interesting. And speaking of like making your own business, you mentioned, I want you to ask you this. And in the introduction, I also mentioned that you're an art director as well. So I want to
Mhm.
ask you about the experience and like challenges of the leadership role when it comes to like a video game studio or an art studio, and your experience working at that position.
Yeah, sure. So I've worked in those positions for quite a while now, and that's my day job. Generally, I still work for people doing that. So I've been working for a company based in Zurich now, and I've been their character art director for about a year now. And the leadership role, generally, you should generally be very good at what you're doing, so you can problem solve and make nice stuff. That's nice and it's needed, but it's almost not the most important thing because you get rock star artists and they're not good leaders or planners. And the other metric is you are sort of a leader of the team. You're a figurehead. You're kind of like a buffer for your team. You need to accept chaos and sort of organize it, and then sort of disseminate it to your team so they don't get like upset or them. You got to keep the morale up, and then also you got to retain vision and you need to hire and so on so that you bring the right people into the team so you get a good tempo flow of work. So very much you're a figurehead and you have to put a lot of sort of for me it was a lot of personal growth into being able to accept sort of changes and the general chaos that goes on with building a production. It just happens by default. There's nothing bad about it. It is just there. And you need to sort of bring in all those aspects condense them and then propagate them out to a team so they have less, so they can just focus on the work essentially, and they don't have to deal with all the crazy stuff that's going on. So you're very much a leader, and you have to find some sort of inner peace and like be calm, and at least generally have an idea of a solution most of the time, a way out or way to go. It can be wrong, but you should be that person who can decide accordingly and go. And you also have to delegate. So you are not the rock star as an art director. It's a big title, but you shouldn't be taking all the work and taking all the glory. It's not the case. You need to find skilled people who need somebody to lead them and like make them shine. And then you need to like really push a lot of the work that way. So the further you go, and I'm finding this now with a role because I'm hiring, I'm doing less and less of the cool work now and more of the planning and helping and getting and projecting to get the project finished. And that's the kind of space you live in. And there's some people who like naturally do that and they do very well. And some people just want to be artists and do like really high level focused work. And they may not be a leader or a planner. So it depends where you want to go. So it's a lot of soft skills and communication and a lot of projecting and then trying to keep calm while all this is going on. That's the general thing.
All right. And let me ask you another question related to the kind of the subject, which is first, I want to ask you this. Any advice and tips for a good portfolio and resume for artists? And also, what do you look for when, I mean, of course, after
Hmm.
like the whole COVID hit the world, everything turned online, especially the interviews, everything, like most things,
Yeah.
turned online. Um, just in general, I'm not specifically talking about online interviews or just, on-site interview, just in general about the interview process.
Hmm.
What do you usually tend to look out for when interviewing someone? Like the red flags,
Yeah.
anything, or green flags as well. Like basically the whole spiel. Tell us
Yes.
how it is usually.
So initially, the work is what attracts an art director or people looking to hire people. The work has to be a certain quality level, and we can go into the metrics of that. And there are metrics there, like how what considered good work. It's not just the quality; it's actually being able to see how it's made and if it's applicable for the end result. We also look at work history because if somebody has done something for a certain amount of time, you can assume they can step through the process pretty in a pretty good way and not get stuck or need help, depending on their seniority in the role. When it comes to the person, and we do, I'm doing this right now. I'm hiring now. So when it comes to the person, it's I must say our team is an English speaking team, so we do look for people who communicate well in English. It's a bit unfair, I do realize, but all our team are English speaking, and we do need somebody who can communicate well in English generally. That's the kind of unfair aspect of it. But beyond that, we look for somebody who is very communicative. And I must say, as a leader, I really respond to people who reveal their weak areas because a lot of people say, yes, 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 I can do stuff. And they may know that they can't do it, but there's this kind of attitude that you'll figure it out or you do it along the way. That's very dangerous for a team because we can't plan or estimate that. That's chaotic. So somebody, when you ask them, like, say that he's a character artist, and you say, "Can you do props?" and somebody's instead of going, "Yes, yes, I can do that," and they maybe never done that, but they feel they can do that, they go, "I'm not comfortable saying I can do that. I can't do that right now. I may need some time to learn that, or it's just not what I really do." And that's really, really helpful because that helps us plan our team because we need to estimate well, we need to know what we can deliver. So if somebody's coming in with a loose skill set, which they said they can do, but they can't actually do it very well, it leads to massive chaos in the team. And we've actually had this recently. I won't go into too much detail. Somebody said they could do something, but it turns out they can't. And that team is in turmoil right now because of that, because this was quite an important hire. So that kind of honesty and revealing of some weak areas or weakness, honesty about where you can't do stuff too well or you haven't done it before is massive. And we can read that generally in the interview, and it really bodes well for a person who's honest about their abilities. So I'd say that's probably one of the biggest things.
All right, interesting. And yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense when like in a world where everyone is like, yes, I can do that, and are yes mans, and they want to just portray themselves as some type of super artist or something that they can just
Yeah, there's
just
definitely a
power
culture.
through. Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah,
kind of breeze of fresh air when someone just honestly says, "No, I'm not really good at that, but I can develop it." And you can hear in someone's voice when they're being real
yeah,
or just they're
yeah.
just bullshitting someone.
There's a culture now, and it's been recent in the last 10 years or so, where you can do anything, and you're like, it's up to you. You can find a way. But when you're talking about trying to work with a team and deliver something on time, that is massively chaotic. It's terrible. So you're looking for somebody who's very honest about their things. And I before this, I started up a outsourcing studio with some friends. So we were outsourcing for EA and all those people. And the biggest thing I learned from my boss there was that when a job came up, so say we specialize in building characters and we did characters and animation. And one of the things was they'd come along and say, can you do like an animated promo? You're like, a full rendered thing, full pipeline. The temptation, this is EA, it's like a big project like AAA. Temptation is to say, yes, 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 we can do it because, well, lots of money and a very famous project. We turned a lot of those down. He turned them down because he said, we can do 70% of the pipeline, but 30% we won't do, which means we're going to struggle and mess around. And we're going to do it in front of this client who's going to watch us doing it. And that's going to like lower our value in their eyes. And it's a bad thing to do. So he turned that work down. And then the clients really respected us for us. And they kept on coming back trying to pull us in. And eventually they gave us a job which was just our skill set. And we knew we could do the 100% of the whole pipeline. And we did that job and it was very successful. And so like the go back to the people, you want people who are very honest about their skill set, so I can foresee and plan where I'm going to place them in a team. So they say, listen, I'm a character artist, but I kind of suck at doing hair or heads. And I'm like, okay, well, then you'll do this part of the pipeline, but I got a guy who's good at heads and hair, and he'll come and do that bit for you. But if they go, yes, 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 I can do heads and hair, and then I give them a task and they spend like 2 months on it, and it's just like it blows apart the whole scheduling, really bad. And it's a common problem, and it's kind of like a thing. You can't plan for it because it just keeps on happening. But if somebody's honest about their ability set, it helps you calm down the whole pipeline and plan properly. So I think that's the main thing. And then beyond that, yeah, some artists can be like they're quite insular people. They sit in their rooms or their office all day, and they may not communicate well. So you have to be careful with those people because they can be quite hard to like. You want people who are proactive. When another skill set is when you hit a problem is not to sit there and go down a tunnel and then sit days on it, but actually stop, find somebody who may be able to help you, and then pester them to help you, and then get them to help. So it's that sort of proactive and communication nature, which is also a very nice thing to see if you see it.
All right, and actually, I think this episode is going to be a really helpful one because I've never had like someone this experience like in a leadership role, and being familiar with all these aspects of like working in a team. I think this is going to be helpful to a lot of people this
Great,
episode.
cool, good. That's what I hope.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and all right, the next question is, who are your favorite artists and designers that have personally inspired you the most? Yeah, I know
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
hard one. I know.
No, no, I have these so that for me personally as an artist, a while back, I stepped back and trying to define my pillars. I actually watched a podcast with Loish, who's that, I think she's a Belgian or she may be from Netherlands, very famous artist. But I've been thinking about this for a while, and then she defined it for me. Like she had locked down her pillars, and I didn't really know what my art pillars were for me personally. So I have favorite artists; it's kind of a separate thing. But my art pillars are generally I love classical Baroque art, like sculpture. So there'll be like a Caravaggio or a Benini, and then also in that classic art space, I love Rubens, my favorite classic artist. So I have a classic art base. That's one of my things. Then my other one I talked about is like that 80s, 70s pop art, but pop like fantasy art. So I love that stuff. And kind of corny stuff, but it goes towards the Frazetta and so on. But it's in that area. And then I also have a deep love of game design art, which is sort of a new thing. But when you look at a lot of modern games, they have a look or a style, especially when you go towards something like Blizzard or Relic. They have this kind of it's kind of that translation of that 70s, 80s pop art, fantasy art into its own look. So those are my three. And then when it comes to artists, a lot of the classic artists like Rubens and so on, Caravaggio, amazing to study. I quite like some of the weirder classical artists like Hieronymus Bosch. It's really good. Then the more modern ones, Simon Bisley, maybe Frazetta a bit. And then the modern artist, the one modern artist who's like been quite influential on me. There's a guy called, I can't remember his name, Pascal Blanche. He's a 3D artist, and he does that kind of 70s, 80s look, but in CG, and he's progressed it to a bit of a new look from here. And then he also is doing collectibles now. So I think that's the general sort of metric of it. Yeah, those are the people I look to and really admire. So some of them are a lot of 2D artists, but few 3D artists and sculptors too.
All right. And what are you working on right now that you can tell us about? What kind of project is it? I mean, of course, if it's something that there's NDA involved, we can skip right past this question.
It is an
But
NDAs, but I can give you an idea.
all right.
My primary job today is the character art director for this indie team, and we are working on something based on a fantasy world with puppets, and it's got a Slavic European sort of mythology behind it. That's my main job day to day, and then I'm working on a book writing about what we're talking about, like creation of characters and a lot of the things we're chatting about, and that's for Routledge in Oxford. So writing a book too. And then when I have time, I also accept commissions for collectibles. So right now, there was a team who ran a very successful Kickstarter. So they're doing the tiers. When Kickstarter, if it's successful, it has tiers of deliveries. So I did one of the initial sculptures, and now they've got tiers now. So I'm doing a few more tiers of their stuff. So it's giant fantasy creatures. And then I also do another client is doing military history collectibles. So you think of like, people who collect figurines or like World War II soldiers or like Roman centurions. So it's kind of specific in its own way because you have to be very, very accurate with the uniforms and stuff because the people who are into that stuff, they're really into that stuff. So if you get like a holster wrong for like an American GI or something, they'll know and they'll get like very jumpy about it. So it's nice because I like military history, but it's kind of a different thing as well. Whereas the fantasy ones, it's a lot looser. You are modeling hard and fast, and it's all about pose and feel and is it cool. And so you have to focus on that. Whereas the military history stuff is it accurate? And so that's the general process right now. That's the stuff I'm working on.
All right. Awesome. And all right, the next question is kind of a breakaway from all these technical questions. So, all right, here it is. What areas beside the area you're working on right now, which is of course in the general fields of arts and visual development and stuff like that, would you be interested to explore and learn in the future, given if you had like enough time and energy and just everything was
Yeah.
okay? And it could be, by the
Um,
way, anything non-art related, by the way.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I have a background in 2D drawing. I would like to get back to it. I don't have much time at the moment, but I bought like a draftsman table, and so ideally I'll get back into that. I'd like to do a bit more 3D printing stuff because I just find it very interesting and it's developing a lot. So I do a little bit of that, but I'd like to do more. And then possibly getting back into classic sculpture again, working with clay and so on. That would be nice, but I haven't done that for a while. Beyond that, the stuff I do outside of art is I focus on fitness and stuff just because I sit behind a computer all day. You tend to become a bit of a sphere. So I try to like just get out and do physical activities across the board. And that'll be my focus outside of making art.
All right, awesome. Sounds nice. But I mean, all right, for everyone who's listening or watching this podcast, I want to ask everyone to, if you're behind the chair, sit back, stand up, and do some stretches. I mean, I'm not going to do it because I'm recording the
Yeah,
podcast, but
yeah.
that's a good reminder because I've recently been having this problem with my back, and because
Yeah, I've
I
got that
don't have
too.
it. Yeah, most artists do. Let's be real. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't have a chair behind me, so I have to always keep in mind of my posture. So yeah, that's
No,
alongside
it's
all
very
of
real.
this.
And like I'm
Yeah.
getting older now. So I've been in this like doing sitting for years and years and years.
Mm.
And it's a part of my day or my career planning or whatever to be physical. I got a standing desk. I go out for a jog every day and swim. I got the back pain too, and it just comes from sitting and stressing out in
Hmm.
front of a computer all day. It's not good. And so you actually have to start actively planning this in. Uh, I've always been aware of it, but yeah, it's becoming more and more of a thing where I have to get out and be active and stretch, and even consider doing things like yoga and so on. This lifestyle is actually somewhat detrimental the older you get, and so you have to actively plan ways to be fit and strong to keep on doing it. Otherwise, you're gonna face problems.
Yeah, exactly. And all right, we've reached the final question of the podcast, which is a section called Final Words. All right, let me explain what it means. For anyone who might listen to this episode of podcast once, of course, it's edited and uploaded in the future, whether it be a week from now, months, years, decades from now, for anyone who have been listening to this podcast and now reached this point of the podcast, you have a window of time and this opportunity to leave them any message or messages as a human to another human being. It could be, it's of course a non-art related. Sorry, I put you on the spot, I know, but that's the point of this question. What would those stuff be?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've got some because I've been thinking about this stuff somewhat recently. I think for me personally, and I think everybody has to consider, I find it personally more gratifying to focus on the craft of what you're passionate about and less the prestige of the things you're doing. Being in the industry a long time, the things I've valued is the enjoying of the work and then the people I've worked with. You hear this a lot and it's corny, but the people I worked with is one of the main benefits, and I carry those friendships through my life. I've worked on some very prestigious projects, but it kind of doesn't matter. And then right now I'm focusing on more on projects which just make me happy and give me a good quality of life. And I've actually turned down some pretty high level roles recently because yes, they there's names and lights and all that and big projects, but it just wasn't right. And I'd prefer to like spend more time doing my own thing and then focusing on the craft which I love. So just finding your joy in creating the thing, and then you kind of insulate yourself up against chaos, because if you can just work on the thing every day and find joy doing that, you're less there's less externalities affecting you, because that grand job or that grand project could be cancelled or pulled, or you could just like not like working there and you have to like go, and then you got like, what do I do now, because my whole identity was that thing. So if it's just like the passion of making the thing, you always have that, and nobody can take that away from you. And then beyond that, I just like say like focus on other aspects of your life, try and stay fit, stay healthy, just get out there in the sun. The relationships with the important people in your life will sustain you as well as all that exercise and stuff, so you can carry on working and be happy. Because just sitting in front of the computer or the drafting table alone is not enough. You need to find those other things which build you up and make you strong, so you can keep on working and making cool stuff.
All right, that's actually a really good point to end this episode on. I mean, you hit the nail on the head with that. And well, thank you so much for coming by and joining us for this episode. And thank you to anyone who tuned in and listened to this episode, whether on audio platforms or YouTube or anywhere. If there was any suggestions or critiques or anything about the future episodes or maybe about this episodes or any particular questions you might have, please leave them down in the comments, whether on Castbox, YouTube, or Instagram, and I will definitely check them all out. And that's about it. Till next episode, take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye bye.